To order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. And before I deliver my opening remarks, I just wanted to note the unusual circumstances under which we're operating today. Pursuant to House Resolution 8, today the subcommittee is meeting virtually. I want to announce a couple of reminders to the members about the conduct of this remote hearing. First, members should keep their video feed on as long as they are present at the hearing. Members are responsible for their own microphones. Please also keep your microphones muted unless you're speaking. If members have documents they wish to submit for the record, please email them to the committee clerk, whose email has been circulated prior to the hearing. Well, good morning and thank you to all of our members and panelists for joining us today for this subcommittee hearing on the brain drain from the federal scientific workforce. This is our first subcommittee hearing of the 117th Congress, and I'm very pleased to return as the chairman of the Investigations and Oversight Subcommittee to continue our important work. I'm also pleased to welcome Ranking Member Obernolte to the subcommittee. I look forward to working together in support of America's scientific community to ensure that our country remains in its position as the global leader in science and innovation. Today's hearing focuses on a subject close to my heart, the federal scientific workforce. The scientists of the federal government are a pillar of some of America's greatest achievements, and federally funded science is a key to long-term economic growth. Today's hearing is doubly important. First, the STEM workforce has been under stress in recent years, as we will be discussing. And secondly, we stand on the cusp of what we all hope will be kind of a Sputnik-like moment for federally funded scientific research. We're in a historic position where Democrats and Republicans on this committee and Republicans and Democrats in the Senate have dueling proposals to double the scientific research budget in this country. And maintaining proper stewardship on what we all hope will be a historic return to an adequate level of funding for scientific research will require a top-notch and well-experienced federally funded STEM workforce. Government scientists oversee grants for priority research areas, fund basic research that expands our horizons through breakthrough discoveries, and lead the way in helping to address the most pressing challenges of our time, from climate change and clean energy to public health to national security. Whether pushing the boundaries of scientific knowledge or informing policymaking with the best available science, government scientists perform a vital public service. Unfortunately, in recent years have been difficult for many career government scientists. The last administration's hostility towards evidence-based decision-making often created significant tension, with scientists simply attempting to carry out their duties. And as violations of scientific integrity worsened and political interference escalated, scientists often felt marginalized and demoralized. Far too often, they saw their expertise ignored, their motives were impugned, their work was dismissed. And this crisis arrived after years of budget constraints had already slashed their funding. Sadly, one of the consequences of failure to properly support the federal scientific workforce are clear. In critical science-based agencies and occupations, far too many scientists have recently decided to leave the federal government. The statistics are alarming. According to data reviewed by the committee staff, EPA's workforce declined by 3.9% in the last administration and over 16% since 2009. DOE's civil service STEM workforce has not increased in 4 years. The EPA, DOE, and NOAA have all lost large numbers of STEM workers in key occupations, such as the environmental protection specialists, nuclear engineers, and oceanographers. Even offices with broad bipartisan support have not been spared. The DOE's Office of Nuclear Energy lost over 20% of its workforce in the first 3 years of the previous administration. And many science agencies see that the remaining outside gender, racial, and ethnic employment disparities persisting in their STEM workforces. These facts show just how much federal scientific capacity is at risk of being lost due to scientific workforce reductions. The departure of so much scientific talent and institutional knowledge from the government represents a competitive disadvantage for the United States, We must fix this. We can rebuild the federal scientific workforce, but to do so, we must recommit ourselves to strengthening scientific integrity in the federal government and supporting career scientists. Today's discussion will help us understand how we got here, the implications of a reduced scientific workforce, and how best to reverse these trends and restore federal scientific capacity. I'm eager to hear from our expert witnesses who are strong advocates for career scientists and the role of science in government. I look forward to hearing your ideas on how we can address this issue. I'm also attaching a majority staff report as part of my written statement for the record. The report has been shared with the minority and represents the majority staff view on many of the issues here. And now I'll turn it over to my Republican colleague.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Foster. I am honored to serve as the ranking member for the subcommittee. The subcommittee's jurisdiction is near and dear to my heart, as you know. And I think that the subject of our hearing today is one of critical importance. We absolutely need a strong, dedicated, and talented federal scientific workforce. And we need to make sure that we retain those people and that we recruit the best of what is coming out of our nation's schools and universities. I'm very much looking forward to hearing what our expert witnesses has to say. We're focusing this hearing today mostly on retention. And I think that that's of critical importance, but I'd also like to see us focus a little bit on recruitment. I think that our federal government needs to be entrepreneurial in our approach to getting the best talent that we can. And that means that we need to be cognizant of the fact that we're competing against not only other government agencies, but against academia and against the private sector in recruiting top scientific talent for our federal workforce. So we need to make sure that we've set the stage for success in that area. Of particular concern to me is the fact that it takes 98 days to fully onboard a scientist into our federal workforce right now. And compared with private sector where I come from, that is shocking to me. We can't be surprised that we're failing to recruit the most talented and the brightest people that are coming out of our universities when our bureaucracy is that sluggish. So I'm looking forward to hearing from the testimony of our expert witnesses and looking forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask 1 minute unanimous consent to speak.
Yes, granted.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate this. I would like for us also to keep in mind that during the period of time that preceded this by a few years, on a bipartisan basis, Republicans and Democrats changed processes, many of them, including the NIH, and how the NIH not only gets its money, but is able to make it mandatory as opposed to discretionary, and that there has been a substantial amount of time and I believe progress that at least Chairman Lucas and Chairman Mr. Perlmutter would recognize. We've not been without understanding this challenge. We have made many important things, but we also had the United States Air Force using our government techniques, and they blew up 10 Titan missiles, rockets, and we felt like we had to go to outside sources, which really the content and the technology exists within America. It just may not be employed by the government. And as an example of that is SpaceX, which is located in Waco, Texas, which I represent. We have taken ideas from landing capsules out in the middle of the Pacific to where they land on the deck of a ship. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, but I think it's important for us to note this did not just happen. There's been a lot of work that has been bipartisan that has included a definite effort to make sure that we grew scientists, not just those that work for the government. Thank you very much. I yield back my time, sir.
Thank you. And I really concur with that. You know, one of the proudest bipartisan achievements, particularly the last several years, is that we've seen proposals to really cut the federal scientific budget, and Republicans and Democrats have stood together to say no, that these things should be preserved. And that was one of the greatest bipartisan achievements of the recent past. And now I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Ms. Candice Wright. Ms. Wright is an acting director at the GAO in its Science, Technology, Assessment, and Analytics team. She oversees GAO's work on the management of federally funded research intellectual property protection and management, and federal efforts to help commercialize innovative technologies and enhance the U.S. economic competitiveness. She has also served as a congressional detailee to the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs, and as the head of the GAO's office in Kabul, Afghanistan. Wow. And, you know, people complain about being posted in Kansas City. After Ms. Wright is Mr. Max Stier. Mr. Stier is president and CEO of the Partnership for Public Service, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to revitalizing our federal government, the workforce of our federal government, by inspiring a new generation to serve. Previously, Mr. Stier worked in all three branches of the federal government, including a clerk for Supreme Court Justice David Souter. He is also currently a member of the New York State Spending and Government Efficiency Commission and the Brookings Institution's Public Sector Leadership Advisory Board. Our third witness is Dr. Andrew Rosenberg. Dr. Rosenberg is the director of the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. He has more than 30 years of experience in government service, as well as academic and nonprofit leadership. Dr. Rosenberg has offered peer-reviewed studies and reports on fisheries and ocean management, and has published at the intersection between science and policymaking. He previously served as the chief scientist at Conservation International, the dean of life sciences at the University of New Hampshire, and the deputy director for the U.S. National Marine Fisheries Institute. Our final witness is Dr. Betsy Southerland. Dr. Southerland retired from her position as director of the Office of Science and Technology in the EPA's Office of Water in 2017, following a 33-year career with the agency. While at the EPA, Dr. Southerland led the development of national regulations and guidance manuals informed by science and through coordination with state environmental agencies, industry representatives, and environmental groups. In 2015, Dr. Southerland received the Distinguished Presidential Rank Award for her career at the EPA. And as our witnesses should know, you will each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included for the hearing. And when you all have completed your spoken testimony, we will begin questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. And so we will start with Ms. Wright.
Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Obernolte, and members of the subcommittee, I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the federal science and technology workforce. Agencies face the difficult task of keeping pace with advances in science and technology. In our prior work, GAO has seen how agencies often struggle to attract and retain a workforce that meets their needs and positions them for the future to address the complex social, economic, and security challenges facing the country, not to mention the COVID-19 pandemic. Our longstanding concerns have led us to include strategic human capital management in GAO's high-risk series since 2001. Today, I will highlight GAO's past work that can provide insights in 3 key areas. First, workforce planning. Second, pay and hiring authorities. And third, the federal work environment. With regard to the first area, strengthening human capital management, particularly for agencies with science and technology missions, can help them build a highly diverse, highly qualified, and agile workforce. To successfully implement their missions, agencies need to identify current skill gaps and future needs in the workforce. They also need to select the right human capital strategies to fill them. However, our prior work has identified workforce strategic planning challenges that agencies have not fully addressed. In October 2019, we found that 18 of the 24 agencies we reviewed had not fully implemented certain key workforce activities, such as establishing a workforce planning process or developing strategies to address gaps in staffing. We recommended agencies such as the National Science Foundation fully implement these activities, but not all agencies have done so. We've also reported on NSF's use of rotators who are outside scientists and engineers on temporary assignment. We made 2 recommendations aimed at improving NSF's workforce strategy for balancing its use of rotators with permanent staff. On the second area, improving federal pay and hiring can help agencies compete with employers in other sectors. Agencies can tap an array of incentives when they need to recruit or retain experts in fields such as cybersecurity, engineering, or in other high-demand fields. Special payment authorities allow agencies to pay higher wages, help pay off student loans, and provide other incentives. In December 2017, we reported that fewer than 6% of employees at 27 agencies reviewed received special payments. Agencies reported that incentives were helpful, but the extent of impacts was not known, and the Office of Personnel Management has not assessed how the authorities help improve recruitment and retention. Similarly, agencies have multiple hiring authorities that afford flexibility in the hiring process. In August 2016, we reported on 105 hiring authorities. Among the most used authorities was direct hire, which allows agencies to fill positions that have a severe candidate shortage or a critical need, such as for STEM personnel. OPM and agencies have not analyzed the effectiveness of such hiring authorities. GAO made 6 recommendations to OPM to assess and improve the use of pay and hiring authorities, and OPM is in varying stages of implementation. For the third area, our work has identified several factors that, if left unaddressed, may negatively influence agencies' ability to attract, hire, and retain a diverse, highly skilled science and technology workforce. For example, we reported last year that individuals who experience sexual harassment at work are more likely to leave their jobs. We've made recommendations to agencies to improve implementation of their policies and procedures to prevent and address sexual harassment, both in their own workforce and also at the university level, as federal research grant recipients can be an important part of the pipeline for the future federal workforce. In April 2019, we reported that while selected agencies we reviewed had taken various actions to help achieve the objectives of their scientific integrity policies, additional actions were needed. Here, we made 10 recommendations to 6 agencies to address various issues, including developing procedures to identify and address scientific integrity policy violations. In closing, science and technology is integral to how agencies execute their mission. The federal government's success in attracting, hiring, and retaining a world-class science and technology workforce is tied to how it effectively and strategically utilizes the wide range of available authorities and other resources. As science and technology continues to rapidly evolve, so too must the government's recruitment and retention efforts. How the government responds, or doesn't, to face its human capital challenges today will have lasting effects for the future workforce it needs. Chairman Foster, Ranking Member Obernolte, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my statement. I would be pleased to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you very much for that. And thank you for all the work that you and the GAO does, every year for us. So reading over your written testimony earlier reminded me of how important it is to have you around to lengthen the attention span of the U.S. Congress. And so next is Mr. Stier.
Thank you, Chairman Foster and Ranking Member Obernolte and all the members of the subcommittee. It's tremendous to see the bipartisan approach that you've taken to such a vital issue. Your committee staff has done an exceptional job at laying out the problem, and I thought I would take my time to talk about why the problem exists and offering a few recommendations about what you can do about it. Starting with why the problem exists. If we don't understand that in the right way, we'll never solve it. And there are 5 big reasons that I would focus on in terms of the problems that are facing recruiting and hiring top-tier STEM talent. Begins with the fact that the federal brand itself has been damaged. Government shutdowns, hiring freezes, negative rhetoric, political interference in science have all tarnished that brand. Number 2, opportunities for young people are hidden and scarce. You can see this from one devastating statistic. Just 4% of new hires in the federal government are drawn from federal programs employing current students and recent graduates. The talent doesn't know about the opportunities, and therefore they can't even pursue them. Number 3, and really important, the hiring process is deeply broken. The barriers to entry are many. I could take my entire 5 minutes and many more on this issue. One stat that has already been cited is that it takes nearly 100 days to hire people on average, which is more than double what you'd see in the private sector. But the barriers are way more diverse and problematic than that. And number 4, very important here, even when people are hired into the STEM field, we aren't retaining that talent once recruited. Of the full-time employees under 30 who voluntarily quit the federal government, nearly 3/4 of them have only been there for 2 years. One of the key reasons for this is that we're not creating an environment that is welcoming, that grows them. We see that in our best places to work employee engagement scores, which are 15 points below in the federal government than they are in the private sector. And finally, clearly, diversity in STEM is a real issue in the general workforce and a very prominent one in the federal government itself. So now we need to do more than just admire this problem. We need to actually do something about it. So here are 10 quick ideas that I can extend on if they're interested in the question and answer period. Number one, it begins with leadership. We need to create high expectations of federal leaders to own this problem, and that includes in Congress. The work that you're doing is fundamental. We have a public sector leadership model. What does it look like to be a leader in government? And I would advise that this committee and Congress more generally hold executives to that model. There's also, in terms of accountability, our best places to work rankings around effective leadership. And finally, I would say we ultimately need to reduce the number of political appointees, and that would make a big difference. Number two, we need to promote the government's mission. And this is something that NASA has done very well as an example with their custom-built career website that includes video stories of great things that NASA people are doing. We have our Service to America medals. We need to tell the stories that will then encourage others to follow. Number three, we need to improve recruiting and hiring. Again, lots to be done here, but the beginning point is to enact the civil service recommendations from the final report of the National Commission on Military, National, and Public Service. They did a tremendous job. That stuff is ready to go. Number four, we need to get young people in government. And one of the key ways to do that is to have internships be the primary mechanism of bringing them in. Government doesn't use internships nearly enough, paid internships, and there's more that can be done. Number five, we need to promote innovative talent models. Partnership has the Cyber Talent Initiative, where we work with several companies, MasterCard, Microsoft, Workday, and a dozen federal agencies to create a 2-year special fellowship for top talent in cyber to come into government. Those kinds of special channels work, and we need to invest in more of them. Number six, we need to overhaul the pay and classification system. Think about it. The pay system we use today was designed in 1949. No private sector company is in business today operating on the same system as it did 70 years ago with respect to compensation. Doesn't work. Number seven, we need to invest in the HR workforce and create a government-wide STEM human capital strategy. It's one government, and yet it operates vertically. Not good enough. Number eight, we need to create a culture that embraces technology, innovation, and collaboration. The pandemic has created lots of innovation. It should serve as a future model of how government can operate. Lots to talk about there. 9, I mentioned DEI has to be a key part of this workforce strategy, diversity, equity, and inclusion at all levels, including the leadership in government. And number 10, we need your continued oversight. This ought to be an annual hearing. We ought to learn from agencies across the board. And you need to visit agencies and see what they're doing. There's great things that are going on. And finally, help with the government brand by telling great stories about what's happening. Thank you so much.
And thank you. And I think the last thing or second to last thing you said was spot on. The importance of having members of Congress visit the agencies. You know, one of my biggest activities in Congress is as the co-chair of the National Labs Caucus, where I drag members of Congress around to visit the Department of Energy National Labs, which is, you know, they're without exception, just blown away with the tremendous science that's being done there. And equally important would be in-person visits to all of the science operations in all of our federal agencies. So I definitely agree with that. And so next is Dr. Rosenberg.
Thank you, Chairman Foster and Ranking Member Obernolte and members of the subcommittee. My name is Andrew Rosenberg, and I direct the Center for Science and Democracy at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Federal scientists are on the front lines of our nation's capability to respond to society's needs, from forecasting natural disasters to natural resource management to responding to pandemics, and federally funded basic research that enables scientific discovery and innovation is critical to economic growth, employment, and sustainable development. All science-based agencies, from the Defense Department to NASA to the Departments of Agriculture, Commerce, and Energy, depend on a strong, continuously renewed scientific workforce. The last 4 years have seen a significant reduction in the scientific workforce at many federal agencies. Our report, The Federal Brain Drain, found that 5 of the 7 agencies we analyzed collectively lost more than 1,000 scientific staff. Few agencies fared worse than the Environmental Protection Agency. In the last 4 years, EPA lost nearly 6% of its workforce, more than 670 staff, including in regional offices, especially in the West, Southwest, and Midwest. For some agencies, growth stagnated. The CDC lost 187 scientific staff prior to the pandemic. That's a loss of 2.2%. Now, we recognize that demography was part of the driving force of this loss, but the inflow of new talent was squeezed as well. Fellowships were curtailed and recruitment was stagnant. Morale matters too for retention, recruitment, and productivity. We tracked more than 190 instances of attacks on science during the Trump administration, far outnumbering previous administrations. When we surveyed more than 4,000 federal scientists in 2018, 80% of respondents said they noticed workforce reductions, and nearly 90% reported that these losses made it difficult to fulfill their missions. And at the EPA, fewer than 15% of surveyed scientists reported their morale as excellent or good. In January, the Biden administration issued a key memorandum on restoring trust at government agencies through scientific integrity and evidence-based policymaking. That's an important step for restoring morale, but more is needed. Representative Tonko has reintroduced the Scientific Integrity Act, which would codify in statute the prevention of political interference or manipulation of scientific evidence. The administration and Congress need to rebuild and strengthen federal scientific capacity, diversify the scientific workforce, and revitalize the pipeline that brings early career scientists into civil service. Specifically, increasing fellowship programs such as the Presidential Management Fellowship, the STAR, the Sea Grant, the Oak Ridge programs bring new talent to agencies, but they have been curtailed and need to expand again. New fellowship programs should be created that tackle other science-related issues, such as climate change or equity and environmental justice. And to diversify the workforce, agencies must also ensure that recruitment is broader and compensation resources and benefits for fellows are sufficient for those with economic challenges, not just the privileged few. Recruitment must reach new audiences and counteract the tendency for hiring managers to recruit from a known set of institutions again and again. Every effort should be made to recruit by hosting far more events at historically Black, Hispanic, and tribal institutions. The administration must learn from private and nonprofit sectors about recruiting tools. Job fairs and other techniques must target a wider array of institutions than in the past and account for historical disparities in recruitment and hiring. And agencies must learn to work effectively with institutions unaccustomed to steering students towards civil service. If you want to see how outdated the recruitment system is, just have a look at USA Jobs, the website that we currently use. Reaching scientific capacity quickly will require not only recruiting and hiring to fill vacancies, but also re-engaging with those that have retired from federal service to regain lost knowledge, experience, and expertise. Federal agencies must train mid and senior level scientists in leadership of diverse staffs. Effective science leaders and mentors are not necessarily those who publish the most papers or have been in service the longest. These are learned skills critical for the effectiveness of any enterprise. And young scientists today are used to changing jobs and career paths frequently, so the civil service must evolve accordingly, more extensively utilizing programs for rotating assignments, remote work, joint appointments, and joint institutes increases career flexibility. I appreciate the opportunity to share my views, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
I have to mute. And thank you. And next is Dr. Southerland.
Thank you. Chairman, ranking member, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I had the privilege of working at EPA from 1984 until August of 2017. With my PhD in environmental sciences and engineering, I worked first as a scientist and then as a manager of scientists in EPA's water and Superfund programs. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. While I know that EPA currently has a dedicated team of knowledgeable, highly qualified career professionals, today's staffing levels are the lowest they have been in 30 years. In addition, several hundred career scientists have reported over the past 2 years that their research findings were altered or suppressed for other than technical reasons. As a result, I believe the complex environmental challenges of the 21st century cannot be successfully addressed unless Congress and the administration work together to significantly increase EPA staff levels and EPA leadership rebuilds the morale of the workforce. Since my retirement, I've been a member of the Environmental Protection Network, a bipartisan organization of EPA alumni volunteering their time to protect the integrity of EPA and its mission. I am here, however, in my personal capacity. EPA has experienced years of declining resources with significant loss of buying power and reductions in staff, despite the fact that congressionally mandated responsibilities have increased substantially over that time. In terms of inflation-adjusted dollars, Administrator Regan will have 1/2 the resources that the agency had in 1980. In 2013 and 14, the Obama administration gave early out retirements to certain senior scientists in order to reduce grade levels and the dollars per full-time equivalent employee. EPA had not backfilled all of those vacated positions when the Trump administration began. Former President Trump requested huge cuts in the agency's staff every year, and his administrators did not authorize any significant hiring until 2020. By 2020, over 670 career scientists had left EPA. While Congress rejected President Trump's requested budget cuts, the agency's appropriations were basically flatlined during these 4 years, further exacerbating the decline in buying power. I can tell you from personal experience that managers and staff in EPA are doing everything they can to compensate for the critically low staff levels, while also struggling with out-of-date information technology and lack of cutting-edge scientific equipment. The lack of staff and resources has forced EPA to focus primarily on those rules with statutory or court-ordered deadlines. Rules without deadlines, no matter how important for public health and environmental protection, are often postponed for years or take years to propose and promulgate. One recent example of such a delayed rule is the Safe Drinking Water Act's lead and copper rule, which was not updated for almost 30 years, despite the high risk lead poses to our children. In order to fully restore the workforce, the new administration should work with Congress to get agreement on a 4-year goal to rebuild EPA's budget to its 40-year average level. This goal would represent a 40% increase from 2021 funding levels. Another key opportunity to restore the workforce is for the new EPA leadership to reinstate the collaborative working relationship with career staff that was lost during the Trump administration. The new leaders should also move quickly to identify priority hires for entry-level and senior-level scientists, to use all available authorities to speed hiring, and invest in a hiring campaign over multiple years that's focused on hiring 1,000 of the best, brightest, diverse STEM graduates. They must also strengthen staff development and strengthen partnerships with EPA bargaining units. In conclusion, it is my hope Congress will take concrete steps to provide the necessary funds to rebuild the staff and core programs and to support critical new initiatives addressing climate change and environmental justice. I look forward to answering your questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you all. And at this point, we'll begin our first round of questions. So the chair will recognize himself for 5 minutes. Before we get started, I have statements here from the American Federation of Government Employees, Local 3403, representing NSF employees in STEM fields, and from the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund to be entered into the hearing record. Without objection, so ordered. I guess, I concur with, all of our witnesses here that the federal government needs to embrace a more innovative and proactive approach in hiring and recruitment efforts, especially for young and diverse scientists. There are really, I think, a real hunger among this generation of scientists coming out of our educational system to do something in public service. And they really, this is something I've had many discussions with about professors. They said you should have a job fair or something like that to, just to make this generation of scientists aware of the really tremendous opportunities. And then I think it's also underappreciated how influential an excellent scientist can be with a career, at least partly in the federal science oversight business. Because you have a tremendous influence that's not often appreciated even by the scientific community. And so this is really for everyone on the panel. And how can things like job fairs, enhanced fellowship programs, streamlined hiring procedures, and reduction of bureaucratic obstacles, what are the most promising initiatives here to really accelerate the rebuilding of the scientific workforce? Mr. Stier, it looked like you were full of ideas here, so we'll start with you.
You're very kind. So, Chairman Foster, I think it's an excellent question, and my advice would be to not think about this as an individual intervention, but rather think about a comprehensive strategy. The reality is the system is breaking down along multiple points, and unless you actually deal with the full set of system failings, you'll wind up maybe improving the situation, but ultimately running into another barrier simply further down the pike. So absolutely, career fairs are great if they're done at the right time. Oftentimes government comes in the spring rather than the fall when a lot of talent is actually thinking about what they want to do. But if the people coming to those fairs, or even people more broadly at the university, haven't been introduced to the opportunities that exist in government, if they're instead thinking about a brand that has been tarnished, then you haven't helped yourself a lot. If the process of hiring is so difficult that even if they're interested, once they get to the career fair, they're turned away, that's a big problem. If they ultimately get hired and they leave quickly, then you simply created a bad brand for the broader set of peers that they have. So I think it's really important to be comprehensive in thinking about how to put your arms around this problem and to see it as a government-wide issue for the STEM occupations, and to create that government-wide strategy that individual agencies can participate in, but that they can collaborate in. Certainly there are things you can do in the meanwhile, but I think if you really want to move the needle and recognizing the world is changing, you need to actually address all those pain points along the life cycle of bringing talent in and keeping it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Dr. Rosenberg?
I certainly agree with that. I also think that we sometimes, we hurt ourselves with the rhetoric that's used around working for the federal government. It is really public service, and you get to do great science with great colleagues, but we need to help people understand that it really is a public service job. You are serving the country. I also think we sometimes hurt ourselves by implying that there is a reduced pipeline. There actually isn't a reduced pipeline, and it is very diverse, but we don't recruit fully from that pipeline. So I mentioned recruiting from minority serving institutions, for example. There are literally thousands of engineers, Black engineers. We work with the Society for Black Engineers who work with a lot of historically Black colleges and universities. There are many, many highly trained engineers and other STEM fields across the country, but we're not reaching them because we go back to the same places to look for staff over and over and over again. And then, as the ranking member noted, our recruitment methods and onboarding procedures are really archaic. And I know this as a government management from years ago. I also know it from my students when I was in academia subsequent to that. The mechanisms for bringing people on board erect so many barriers that by the time a real offer is in place, then they've had other offers if they're really, really excellent talent and really want to move forward. So a lot of these are self-inflicted wounds. It's not because there aren't people there, a very diverse workforce that we could bring on board. It's just we're not doing it effectively.
Thank you. And I guess my time is up, so I will now recognize Mr. Obernolte for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all of our witnesses. This has been a fascinating discussion. My first question is for Dr. Rosenberg. In your testimony, you implied a causal relationship between the policies of the Trump administration and the declines in scientific staffing at the EPA. And you mentioned the statistic that the scientific workforce at the EPA declined by 3.9% during the Trump administration. But I mean, looking at a broader set of statistics, between 2009 and 2020, the scientific workforce at the EPA declined by about 16.6%. So on an annualized basis, those declines were higher during the Obama administration than they were during the Trump administration. Now, I don't find that comforting. I find that alarming because that tells me that this wasn't an isolated incident just tied to the policies of what administration. This is a long-term trend. So, I mean, do you share that concern? Is this isolated, or is this a long-term trend that we need to be concerned with?
Well, I do share the concern that it's a long-term trend, and I did only very briefly mention the role of demographics in the staffing at agencies. So several things have happened at once, and I firmly believe that the policies of the Trump administration, if you like, harmed the brand in those terms. But we also have many scientists of my generation, if you like, I'm going to be 66 in a month or so, that are going to leave the workforce anyway. The question is, do you replace them, or do you replace them only with contractors? And so many previous administrations have shifted to using contract staff. And while that in some cases can be efficient and it might be short-term cost effective, it actually doesn't help build the strength of an agency to do the long-term work, because contractors are always looking for the next opportunity or more permanence. And so this is a long-term trend with multiple factors involved. Now, the Trump administration isn't the only administration that has had challenges on certain issues related to things like scientific integrity, the ability of scientists to do their work without political manipulation or censorship. But it was a more extreme circumstance. So all of those combining factors, I think, are things that need to be addressed to try to stabilize and improve the workforce. Now, that doesn't mean that every scientist coming in will be a 30-year federal employee, because that's not the way people go into their jobs these days. So we need to think of alternative ways for people to move in and out of government. And I happen to be one person who has moved in and out of government, and it's possible but difficult.
Great. Thank you. I completely agree with you. And just following up on that, a question for Mr. Stier. You said something that I found absolutely fascinating about how we need to rebuild the federal brand and make sure that our federal branding is helping us recruit the talent that we need to. And I think Dr. Rosenberg just mentioned something along that same line. So I kind of think that we miss out sometimes on the opportunity to, as Dr. Rosenberg said, play up the fact that we are in the business of public service. So in addition to being able to do great science, we get the opportunity to serve our fellow constituent in ways that are impossible to do in academia and in the private sector. So I just wanted to give you the balance of my time to talk about how we might go about restoring that brand and burnishing that brand, because I think it's extremely important.
Thank you so much. And I think you're 100% right. If you look at the data, our best places to work rankings, what you'll see is, I mentioned earlier, that relative to the private sector, the employee engagement scores are on average 15 points lower in the federal government than they are in the private sector. But if you look at the mission commitment, it's the one place where the federal workforce, wherever you are, NASA, NOAA, NIST, it just beats the private sector with a very big margin. The government has something very special, and it's the reasons why you're all here, as well as the ability to serve the American public. Purpose, mission. And that mission is really the basis for an incredible value proposition. If you look at bluntly the contractor firms, they try to present their mission as what the government should be doing. You're serving the American public. That's why you're here, on and on. So the government is not utilizing its core value proposition, and it needs to do that in a concentrated way. And part of the way it can do that is by telling the story of its own workforce. You think about the amazing people helping the American public in extraordinary ways, innovative ways. Those stories don't go out to the public. They don't even go out to the broader workforce inside the federal government. We do not have a recognition culture in government. There's a lot of infrastructure to find problem, not a lot of infrastructure to find the good things. You actually build more strength and deal with your weaknesses if you have an upside and if you create that recognition culture. So that's where I would begin. Begin from the core strength around mission and around the achievements of the people that are there. Stories matter, and the government has a lot of them that we need to tell better.
Right. Thank you. I completely agree. And just to tie into my opening, I think we need to be more entrepreneurial in our approach to recruiting top talent. We are never going to be able to compete in terms of salary with institutions in the private sector, but we do have a unique advantage in the mission that we fulfill, and I think that's why we're all in government, is this desire to serve our fellow man. So I want to thank you to all of our witnesses. It's been a fascinating discussion.
And thank you. And I will now recognize our colleague from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member. I appreciate the comments of both of you, and just a point. Mr. Obernolte said, competition against the private sector, competition against academia. There's also competition with foreign governments, and we can't forget that. And I'll get back to that in a second. But my first question is to you, Director Wright, and to you, Dr. Rosenberg. You talked about contractors. And in my area, we have the National Renewable Energy Lab, we have NIST labs, we have all sorts of labs. And we've seen the contractor population really grow. Is there a reason for that in terms of the law, or what is it that's driving this move from civilian employment to contractor employment, if you could? And start with you, Director Wright.
Thank you for that question, Congressman Perlmutter. So I would say that, with regard to contractors, there could certainly be a more lucrative opportunity financially that they may see, working in a contractor environment rather than in the federal government. Our work certainly has shown, that you really have to have good practices in place to retain employees, so that they will feel a commitment to the mission, commitment to the work, and not necessarily, just be focused on the financial aspects. There's certainly the opportunity to really hone in on what the function of the government's mission is for the employees, and they might then consider federal employment rather than pursuing opportunities with a contractor. But I think Dr. Rosenberg had touched on the contractor issue, so I'll defer to him for additional comments.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think there's a number of factors at play. Every administration that I've been involved in, which is, the last, going back to the first Bush administration when I was in federal government, beginning my federal service, has wanted to be able to point to statistics showing that they've decreased the size of government. And one way you do that is you have fewer full-time employees, but you replace them with contractors. And so there's a political reason here, I would say, although you're a better judge of that than I am. There also is a reason around the concern for pension obligations, of course, and for flexibility in staff as budgets go up and down. And so stability in agency budgets is an important part of this as well. And more importantly, every other sector, including the nonprofit sector and certainly the for-profit sector, is sort of thinking about jobs as what are the things that we need to do and we know we're going to need to do tomorrow and we're going to need to do in the long term, and what are those things that are shorter term and we need more flexibility to do them. And the government often doesn't do that. So you hire more contractors at places like national labs and within the agencies, even for long-term tasks, because you're not allowed to bring on full-time employees under the hiring system because of the way that budgets are constructed and FTEs are allocated. And that does cause real problems because those scientists are going to look for more stable opportunities. And I know many young scientists who come in as contractors, and that unfortunately is their situation. They're always looking elsewhere.
All right, thank you. Let me ask one more question of Mr. Stier. I noticed that you worked for Jim Leach, then you clerked for judge at the Second Circuit and Supreme Court, and you also touted internships. So you want to expand on why you think internships or clerkships are important for recruiting talent?
Absolutely. And if I could, for 2 seconds, I just want to add that on the contractor point, it's often a workaround. If the hiring system is broken, the only way you can get your talent is through contracting. It's obviously not the right motivation, but it's really important to understand that so much in government is about working around a crazy system. And this is an example of it. Internships, to your question, is a very important issue. If you look at any knowledge-based organization in our country, they get their entry talent primarily through internships. That's true whether it's in the law, like you just mentioned. It's true if you work on the Hill. It's true if you're an economist. It's true everywhere. That's not true in the executive branch, and that's a big problem. By and large, interns are not seen as a core piece or the core piece of the entry pipeline in the federal government. And if anything, the number of folks that are converting from internships into full-time employees is being reduced. Some of this has to do with the fact that, again, leaders don't own this. They don't see this as their responsibility. And as a result, they're not focused on the longer term pipeline that they ought to be paying attention to. Some of it is just bad rules.
Mr. Stier, sorry, my time has expired. I appreciate, I'm going to probably send you a note wanting you to expand on the internships. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for that extra time. I yield back.
Thank you. And we will now recognize our colleague from Texas, Mr. Sessions, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Interesting discussion. I don't believe I have a different perspective than any of the other members here, nor do I think I have a different perspective, but I'd like to throw some things in that simply acknowledge the parameters that we've been talking about. I am well aware that we either made a mistake or we did not when we made the R&D tax credit permanent. That meant that companies that could not count on their R&D budget being part of their regular write-off as an expense changed overnight, and companies began hiring long-term employees. That competed against a lot of universities, against a lot of medical institutions, because the federal government does not, in my opinion, pay anything that would be an end-of-year bonus that competes with stock options or other things that other people provide. My point is that we've got institutions, medical institutions, we've got other areas, universities that just bust their hump to get what they need. And the numbers of people that are out there who are qualified is the issue. And that's why I think, as I recall, Ed, Dr. Barra, perhaps you too, have been involved in science-based projects back at junior and senior high levels. Odyssey of the Mind, these robot competitions, things that bring people to science in 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th grade with equivalent feel-good success stories that continued them through this process. My son, who's now 31, went to one of the leading edge institutions, private school, was a 35 out of 36 and was in about mid-range of his class. A number of people, just a great school. He's the only one that chose to go into medicine. Everybody else that chose to go where they could make money. And so the opportunities that we need to understand, I think, yes, they're in internships. I do agree with that. But we also, I think, need to robustly have, Mr. Chairman, someone who can tell us about the pipeline of the types of contests. Yes, I said that word, but they might be generated through competitions that bring these leading edge people to want to build something better and see what the competition is through, and some of it's just double E, electrical sciences. But I think we ought to hear from people who also do understand the pipeline, junior high, high school. But, you know, I also think that as I went to the labs in New Jersey, I was on the hiring team, and I'll just tell you, we went to University of Chicago, we went to MIT, and we went to Caltech, and we honed our science of what we were after. And I think that these institutions produce leading edge people. We just need more people in the pipeline. So I don't know if anybody, Elizabeth, you may have something on there. Andrew, you may have the young doctors that are here. But I really want to focus on the pipeline. Yes, we need to do a better job of the internships, but we really need to build the number of people who want science as opposed to us grinding each other down on the few that we get. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll let the panel take the remaining 2 seconds that I have. Do any of you
Go ahead, you can take it. Yeah, it seems like 40 seconds are sort of de rigueur here. So if anyone wants to grab 40 seconds, that's legit. All right. Dr. Rosenberg?
Thank you, and thank you for the question. I actually think that the pipeline is much bigger than people appreciate, but as you noted, Congressman, if you go to the University of Chicago and MIT and Caltech, and you keep going back to those places, you're only looking at a limited portion of the people who actually do STEM work. On the other hand, Texas Southern has great engineering and science programs. All of the Houston schools actually, train scientists, but many agencies and many scientists only go back to the places they know repeatedly or the places that they were trained. And that's a very natural tendency. But and I've seen it in every institution that I've worked in, but it does us a disservice when you're trying to expand the opportunity for candidates across a much broader set of institutions to think that it's only the elite institutions that are training people who could do the job. And so that's part of it. The second part I would...
Yeah, I think the 40 seconds of forbearance are sufficient.
Okay, sorry.
I will now recognize our colleague from California, Dr. Vera, for 5 minutes.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And this is fascinating and certainly a long-term challenge. One idea that we've toyed with, and as we think about the debate that's taking place around student debt and whether you retire student debt, I've always thought that instead of just retiring that student debt and forgiving it, we ought to use that as a mechanism to try to get folks to serve, whether that's coming to work in the federal government and filling critical needs, or going out and doing service, through some other mechanism like the Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, or other programs. And, again, I don't know that we get any benefit of just forgiving $50,000 of loans or $100,000 of loans, but if we could get someone to come fill a critical need, and perhaps they work for 4 years, you forgive $50,000 or $100,000 of loans. By that time, they have seen what they could do in the federal government. They're accruing retirement. They're doing some things, and hopefully you can get a cohort of those young Americans to continue to stay and consider a career in the federal government. So that's one thing, and I think we ought to work on that as a subcommittee, perhaps to address this critical need and do something in a bipartisan way. The second piece that we've thought a lot about is there is a talented workforce that has been serving our country in the military and in our armed services, often doing high-level skills, perhaps without a degree, but they're operating, doing cybersecurity work, et cetera. They've learned on the job. When they leave the military, the challenge sometimes is we don't actually recognize and put a value on that skill set. I know most closely in the medical workforce where folks are operating as EMTs, but they don't actually have that formal degree. So now they come out, we don't actually provide a value to that. We may ask them to go back and get a 4-year college degree so then they can enter the workforce. I think it behooves us to think about ways to take some of these folks as they're exiting military service, perhaps to figure out how to value that, bring them into government service, provide some training while they're continuing to work. And I think that's also another potential pipeline of folks that have already demonstrated a commitment to serving the country. And now we could do them a service by giving them a job, getting them in there, and perhaps while they're working, continue to upskill them. I guess to any of the panelists, thoughts on whether the idea of student loan forgiveness. Sure.
So,
Stier, I guess, or Mr. Stier, if you want to take that.
Ms. Wright, do you want to go first, and then I'll go after you?
Okay, sure. I was just going to note that certainly the student loan repayment is one of the pay authorities that agencies are using, and they do say that it, in our work, we've heard from agencies that they do say that it is working well. What we don't know is the extent to which it's working in terms of how long, what does it say about how long people will stay at the agency, and so that's something that we've called on OPM to, look at the effectiveness of these various pay authorities and to understand the extent to which it is working and making an impact in recruitment and retention.
So just to follow up on Ms. Wright comments there is authority. Agencies use it very unevenly, and in my view, not nearly enough. There's clearly more work, as Ms. Wright suggests, how to understand how effective it is. But anecdotally, we're seeing that this is a major deal for talent to be able to have their debt forgiven. And by and large, again, there are very few agencies that use it to the extent that they could. If you want to think about this even more ambitiously, I think there's room to create a program like the ROTC program that the military has for the civilian side, where you're actually getting talent to come in with that service payoff commitment. You're helping them pay for their education while they're getting it, with the expectation then that they will come serve their country in the government. And we've done a bunch of work around this and would love to talk to you if you're interested in that as a concept.
Absolutely. We will follow up on that. So anyone else in the last 18 seconds? Dr. Rosenberg.
Yeah, I would just point out that many students that I talk to would like to go into public service, are more interested in the academic sector, which has become less attractive. They want to do, work for government because they want to make a difference. And money is important, but there are huge barriers, particularly for lower income students, to doing so. Not only student loans, but the ability for compensation on things like internships and fellowships. And that actually needs to be addressed so that you can, again, diversify the workforce, but also just a bigger talent pool of people who can actually afford to take these opportunities.
Great. Thank you. And I yield back.
Thank you. And we will now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Lucas from Oklahoma, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Wright, in your testimony, you note that in October of 2020, GAO reported that various factors, such as unclear job application processes, long wait lines for job offers, had been identified as contributing to the federal government's workforce deficiencies in certain areas and job categories. Can you please elaborate on these findings and how they relate to the USA Jobs portal?
Certainly happy to take that question, Congressman. So I would say with regard to USA Jobs, it's certainly something that many people would say isn't the most user-friendly experience. And GAO actually did work, as you noted last year, looking at what steps OPM is taking to improve the website. Certainly, a couple of things that we identified is that they have really taken a step towards looking at using data analytics, using web analytics, I should say, to understand where their users are coming from, but also to putting in place different features that would allow you to allow the applicant, I should say, to understand, what the status is of their application. Because that was something that they were getting a lot of calls on. There are other things that OPM is considering to help improve the experience with USA Jobs, which would include, letting applicants know how many other applicants have applied, and then also notifying applicants when jobs have been filled. So that's something that they're continuing to work on for the future. They recognize it's a problem and are taking steps to try to improve the system.
Is it true that sometimes it can take an average of 90 days or more for new hires to be onboarded?
We've certainly heard those average timeframes. I think one of the challenges is sort of understanding when one starts the clock for estimating the onboarding time. One of the things that we've heard is consistently a challenge is and contributes to the delays are security clearances. That's something that GAO has reported on, quite a bit in terms of the challenges with getting personnel security clearances on time, and we can see where that is contributing to delays in onboarding.
Mr. Stier, can you provide some insights on how this may be discouraging, especially to recent graduates and early career researchers just entering the workforce? Why that's such a challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is a massive problem, and it's not only the time to hire, which you've identified, and it's a big problem. Great talent is going to have options, and they're going to take the option that is easier for them and more available than wait, especially when they don't know how long it's going to take. So there's no doubt that the government is losing out on a lot of talent. I would note that there are layered other problems beyond that, including the fact that 90% of the job searches involve simply the review of self-reported qualifications or the resume, not actual subject matter experts looking at the resumes and talking to people to determine if they are in fact best qualified for the jobs. And then 50% of the searches wind up getting sent back and never even actually used. This is a deeply broken problem. The front door of USA Jobs is the starting point, but then there are a series of issues where this process breaks down that also have to be addressed.
So it's fair to say then some of the brightest people in the country who may well have many job opportunities, potential choices, become essentially frustrated even at the very beginning, let alone before they become a part of the federal process.
Absolutely.
I can see why that would be so discouraging. Staying with you, Mr. Stier, for a moment, I know we've discussed a variety of topics this morning, but you acknowledge that internships are a critical component of the talent pipeline and confirm that federal agencies should strategically recruit and hire college students. But you also emphasize the benefits of reaching future scientists earlier in their lives. Can you touch for a moment about how STEM education and exposure to the work of federal scientists provides fundamental experiences for students at an early age, perhaps maybe even in elementary school?
Sure. And I think Congressman Sessions had it absolutely right that, there is definite need for the federal government to do better in its recruiting and retaining top STEM talent. And we need to increase the pipeline more broadly for our country writ large. And the way you do that is starting earlier. I would say that role model here is NASA. You hear from Charlie Bolden. He participated, a former NASA administrator for 8 years, astronaut. He did stuff early on in his education. It's the way that the best-in-class organizations actually encourage and improve their brand is to touch people very early on, and there are great ways for the federal government to do that.
I say thank you to all of our witnesses, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And the chair will now recognize my colleague from Illinois, Mr. Caston, for 5 minutes.
Thank you to my colleague from Illinois and our chairman, and thank you so much to our panelists. Dr. Rosenberg, I want to start with you and specifically about a report that UCS did in 2018, in part because it jibed so closely with my own experience and conversations with a lot of EPA staff. You were a report that was detailing a crisis of morale in certain federal scientific agencies, and specifically, if I've got this right, nearly a third of the respondents at EPA felt that, quote, influences of political appointees in your agency or department or the influence of the White House were the greatest barriers to making science-based decisions at that agency. And it seemed to have a pretty clear impact on morale. 2018, less than 15% of EPA scientists surveyed by UCS indicated that their morale was excellent or even good. And that compared with nearly 40% who felt that way in 2007. As I mentioned, that was extremely consistent with conversations I had informally with folks at EPA. Could you just chat a bit with us about how scientific integrity violations, the politicization of science, have contributed to staffing losses at those agencies, and I guess on a more optimistic side, how a scientific integrity statute could help in retaining good scientists?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. And you very accurately cited our survey results. And I should point out that we've been surveying federal scientists for many years now. This was not a one-off effort in 2018. And so we had the ability and have published the comparisons to previous surveys. A couple of things happened. Certainly the politicization of science was a concern with reports being altered or censored. And I think Dr. Southerland can speak to that very directly, particularly at the EPA, but not exclusively at the EPA. You may have seen the report yesterday that in a investigation at the CDC, at least 3 major reports during the course of the pandemic were altered by political appointees or outside actors during the course of the pandemic that related to things such as school opening. But at the EPA, either science was completely sidelined or censored or manipulated, became a recurrent problem. And the second part of that problem was that for many decisions, the career professionals were not even in the room, were not even involved in the decision-making on some of the issues that we worked on. And I can see Dr. Southerland nodding, and she may want to expand on that. So scientific integrity policies, if they are strengthened and codified in statute, can actually give scientists a way to ensure that their scientific evidence will not be politically manipulated. And while that's been articulated by the presidential memorandum, it's not codified in statute right now. And so it could be backed away from in many cases, or is less, carries less weight than if the Scientific Integrity Act went through. So that gives scientists more assurance that the work that they do will actually the evidence that they gather will actually be presented as scientific evidence not manipulated for other reasons. Now, lots of other things go into decision making, but you shouldn't manipulate the scientific evidence to justify a decision.
So I know we're short on time, so let me put this, and I know that you had given a few shout outs to Dr. Southerland, so let me maybe just put this to either one of you would like to answer. We need to atone for the sins of the past, but we also have to deal with the realities of where we are. And as we think about how to restore this workforce, and again, my own experience is that we lost some good and senior talent. So how much of what we need to do going forward is attracting people back who may have left the agency early versus bringing new people in to fill those slots? And what does that mean? Because preparing for the workforce of the future is, of course, a little bit different than attracting people back who are late career stages. And I'm just curious if either of you have any comment about which of those we think is more important to prioritize, given the set of cards we have dealt, however much we may not like them.
So I think I'm finally unmuted by the host. I'm having a lot of trouble with verbal. I think the important thing will be to get the new employees. What we can do with people who have left is we have the ability to bring them on even as temporary mentors or part-time employees that can help restore the institutional knowledge at the agency. But I think the real emphasis needs to be to get us new, qualified young people who can really revitalize the mission.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. And as we bring this to a close, I'd like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Obernolte, for some brief closing comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all four of our panelists. This has been an incredibly helpful discussion. I think we all share a unified belief that we need to enhance the role of scientists in our federal workforce and to create an environment that is welcoming to them and that can be successfully competitive against the other entities that are seeking to hire this talent as it comes out of our schools and universities. So let's definitely continue this discussion as things move forward. I think there were lots of excellent ideas raised here today, and we stand with you unified, ready to try and implement some policy changes that'll help us enhance the competitiveness of the federal government in that respect. So thank you, everyone. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Thank you, and I'd like to reiterate our thanks to our witnesses. Not only for your verbal testimony, but the really high quality written testimony, as well as the documents that they referred to. I confess I stayed up way too late last night reading your written testimony, and I commend it to my colleagues and their staff, really, because this is something that Congress and this committee is going to have to come back to repeatedly, that when we hopefully come up with a plan to double the overall scientific effort, that is accompanied by a plan to overcome the near-term emergency issues as well as the structural changes to ensure that we have the strongest possible scientific workforce for our government. So I thank you all again, and and so the record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from members for any additional questions to the committee that they may have for our witnesses. The witnesses are excused and the hearing is now adjourned.